I want to talk a little bit now about another major issue. And this has to do with the history of capitalism. You know, this is a system that has been around for 300-400 years now as the dominant system. Started in England, spread to Europe, spread to other parts of the world, and has now really truly become a world economic system. But it is important to understand that the current crisis of global capitalism has to be seen in the context of the history. And I'm going to do that briefly with you now because I think the light it sheds on where we are. And here I'm talking particularly to North America, Europe, and Japan, for reasons you'll see, because history is changing for them in a way that demands all of our attention. Let's deal with capitalism in its earliest phase. It begins as merchants and small producers break away from the old system in England and Europe. The old system was called feudalism. Landed mansions, landed plantations with a lord and serfs, they were called. The serfs did all the work. The lord collected what were called rents, lived off of those. People who didn't like living that way, people who broke out of that, ran away from the countryside where feudalism was focused into the cities and towns, which thereby became much larger, starting in the 16th, 17th century, and particularly in what is now Great Britain. And these were runaway peasants, these were small merchants, these were small craftsmen and women. And in the cities, they developed a new relationship. They weren't lord and serf, they were employer and employee, capitalist and worker. And they carved that relationship. And it proved successful. Lots of false starts, lots of capitalisms that got going for a while, sometimes for decades, only to be smashed by the old feudal lords who didn't want to see a new system developed. Sometimes they fell apart on their own because of the tension between the quite successful merchants and capitalists and the workers who weren't very happy at all because they had run away from feudal peasantry, but they had come to the cities where they lived awful lives. Crowded into the cities, cities that weren't prepared for masses of people. They didn't have the housing, they didn't have the sewage, they didn't have anything. And you know, we all know a little bit about those early days. If you've ever read a novel by Charles Dickens, if you've ever read a novel by Émile Zola, if today you ever visit a third world major city, you will see all around it the desperate conditions on the edges of those cities of the people coming in off the countryside who are more than the city can handle, who can't stand the poverty of the countryside, can't stand the conditions there, often feudal-like conditions, and who leave and come to the city. Well, what happened in early capitalism was the following. After a while, conditions got better in the city. Workers struggled and got decent pay. Merchants and capitalists reinvested their money and grew. That's how capitalism grew. And as it did, it pulled in the countryside. Pretty soon it became impossible for the old feudal lords to survive. They were losing their peasants who couldn't be kept down on the farm, who wanted the life of the city, the better wages of the city, the better life in the city. Capitalism, to make a long story short, undermined, overthrew the old feudal lords, sometimes very violently, as in the French Revolution, and really in the American Revolution, because we created an independent country built on capitalism, having broken away from a country that was still, Britain, partly feudal, where the struggle between the feudals and the capital was still going on, and in Europe, very much still going on. So you might say that the first phase of capitalism was good for the city, good for the merchant, good for the capitalist, and good for the worker at the expense of the hinterland inside Britain, France, Germany, elsewhere. In the second phase, after capitalism kind of wins the struggle against feudalism, we get another kind of development, a tremendous explosion after about 1750, 1800, an explosion of capitalism's success. It has defeated feudalism, and it is roaring forward, growing by leaps and bounds, developing new technologies, but it now needs to bring in the resources of the whole world. It's kind of getting the food and raw materials from the agriculture nearby, but it goes further and further afield, the voyages of discovery. And again, to make a long story short, it eventually colonizes the world. The advanced capitalist countries, the first ones, Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Germany, they take over the whole world. They carve up Africa. They take over much of Asia. The United States says, you can't come here. We're going to take over Latin America. It's going to be our manifest destiny to make that a special place. The early successful American capitalists wanted to carve out Latin America for us, for the Americans. And so it was. Capitalism grew spectacularly in North America, Europe, and Japan. And the rest of the world was pretty much ravaged. The raw materials taken out of Latin America, the metals. We learned to enjoy goods that came from there. Coffee, tea, rubber, fill in the blank. The world was our oyster, we in the capitalist center. We even developed languages like that. Periphery, center. Wow. Capitalism growing in the center, ravaging an entire planet, condemning Africa to a poverty it still has and suffers from. And the masses in China likewise. And the masses in India likewise, still. But the workers in the center struggled through unions, through political parties, to get a piece of all of this successful capitalist development in the center. And so their wages rose. And now we come to the third and final chapter of capitalism, the one that's been in place since the 60s and 70s. And here's the lesson for us. Capitalism has developed the technology, the internet, telecommunications, jet travel, so that it can get around the world and touch the world and control the world and see the world literally on a global scale. And the capitalists have noticed something. They're paying much higher wages in North America, Europe, and Japan than they could get away with paying in the parts of the world that they were ravaging in the previous 150 years of colonialism. So they got an idea. We could make more profit if we moved the center of capitalism away from Europe, Japan, and North America and over to China, India, Brazil, and so on. That's where we are, ladies and gentlemen. With or without this crisis, and however soon we get out of it, if we do, the sad news is we're on a long-term development of capitalism. As the capitalists, for the same reason they always did everything, growth, market control, profits. Before, they brought everything in the world to North America, Europe, and Japan. Now they're taking it away. And I don't think most of the people of Europe, North America, and Japan have yet come to terms with what it means to have a capitalist system that used to work in such a way that the wealth of the world was collected and brought here, but is now busy moving a huge portion of the productive wealth of the world somewhere else, and saying to the mass of the people in North America, Europe, and Japan, we really don't need you, and so we're really not going to pay you, neither directly in the form of a decent job with decent pay. For many of you, there'll be no jobs at all. And we're not going to fund the government to give you social services because we're not focused on you. Our growth is somewhere else. We used to provide no social services in the third world. Now we're providing them there because that's where we're producing. We'll bring back the profits, and those will make wealthy people out of the top 10% in Europe, North America, and Japan. But for the average person, No, no, no. The same system that developed through the first and second stages of capitalism is the system we have now. But the very logic of capitalism, the same logic all the way through, is now bringing bad results for North America, Europe, and Japan. The jobs are going to India, China, Brazil, and so on. And Americans have to understand, if they permit capitalism to continue in the same logic and in the same way that it always has, they will not be the beneficiaries as they were, because capitalism's way of functioning has set its sights on growth, development, and prosperity somewhere else. It's a serious question, long overdue for the debate that our society is afraid to begin on what that means.